Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, welcome. We are so grateful to have you here joining us today on this webinar. I'm Rebekah Gowler. I use she pronouns. I'm a project director here at HIP on our capacity building team, and I'm joining you today from the occupied homeland of the Dakota people in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I'm joined by my colleague, Victoria.
Good day, everyone. I hope you are all well and welcome. My name is Victoria A. Davis. I use the she, her pronoun series, and I am a senior program associate at our capacity building team here at HIP. One second, I have my transcripts on so I can see. But I live and work on the unceded land of the Patwin, Miwok, and Nisenan people, also known as West Sacramento, California. As we get started today, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping things. Transcription is available via Zoom. You can access this by selecting the show captions at the bottom of your window to open the live transcript. We ask that you please use the Q&A feature to ask questions for speakers. You should have access to both the chat and a Q&A feature, and sometimes your questions will definitely get lost in the chat, so we ask that you put those in the Q&A space. We also invite you to use the chat to share any tech needs or access needs. You also should be able to send those directly to any of our HIP facilitators so that we're able to see your requests directly and so they don't get lost in the chat. We also invite you to just chat with one another, say welcome, give any live time reactions to any of the content we share today. We're really excited to put this out in the world, so we'd love to hear from you. Finally, a recording will be shared afterwards. We are recording today, and we'll make sure to get those who have joined and who were unable to participate today. As we at HIP continue to grow our land, labor, and people acknowledgement practice, we'd love to offer an acknowledgement as we gather in virtual space today. The U.S. occupies stolen land and was built by stolen labor. All of us in the United States reside on the unceded lands of Native peoples. Today, we are gathered in digital space, which is also Native space. I invite us all to take a moment to acknowledge these communities, their past, present, and future generations as the traditional caretakers of this land, and consider the legacy of colonization embedded within systems, structures, technology, and ways of thinking we use every day. We all also live and work in a country that was built on the forced and stolen lives of enslaved Africans. The current U.S. economy, growth and development, institutions, and culture are all directly rooted in the systems of slavery, Jim Crow, and continued racial trauma and oppression. We acknowledge and lift up all the people who unwillingly and forcibly gave their labor and lives in the development of what we now know as the U.S. And we acknowledge and lift up all of their descendants and those who continue to fight for freedom and justice across the country. We honor this practice of land and labor acknowledgements to lift up the original stewards of the land we occupy and acknowledge that these communities are still here and thriving in places we now also call home. It is a way of showing respect and a step towards correcting the histories and practices of exploitation, erasure, and exclusion of Indigenous, Black, and other people of color, and toward inviting and honoring the truth. Land and labor acknowledgements are a starting place, a prelude to commitment and action to support the current struggles and interests of Indigenous communities, Black communities, and all marginalized and exploited people across this land. Land back and reparation movements are working to directly, to directly address and reclaim what has been stolen, and we encourage you all to do a deep dive to learn more. We're also going to drop some resources in the chat for you to learn more about the land where you live and work. So a little bit about Human Impact Partners. We are a national nonprofit based in the Bay Area with staff across the country. Our mission is to transform the field of public health to center equity and to build collective power with social justice movements. Our work is organized into 3 houses of HIP: policy and organizing, bridging partnerships and strategies, and capacity building. Within our policy and organizing work, we focus on a few specific issue areas, including community safety, housing justice, economic security, and climate change. Much of the work we're talking about today sits in our Bridging House, where we are trying to grow partnerships between public health and community power building organizations. So by the end of this webinar today, we'd love for you all to be able to describe the new Health Equity Guide framework and how it applies to health equity practice. We want you to be able to name strategic practices that can advance health equity and racial justice at your organization. And of course, we want you to be able to navigate the new designed Health Equity Guide website. And with that, I will pass it to you, Rebekah.
Great, thanks so much, Victoria. Appreciate you getting us opened here. So we're here to share with you exciting new updates to the Health Equity Guide, one of HIP's core resources to support health equity practice in local health departments and other public health organizations. And so we want to first share some acknowledgements. The Health Equity Guide exists because of the work and wisdom of so many people. We are grateful to everyone who has helped bring the Health Equity Guide to life, both originally and through the most recent updates that we're going to share today. The original development was led by Megan Gatos, a former HIP staff member, with contributions from many other HIP staff. The California Endowment funded the original development, and a group of external advisors lent their ideas and expertise to the content and design. We are internally grateful to all of these folks. You can see a full list of the original contributors in a link that we'll share in the chat. We are also deeply grateful to all of the HIP staff who developed content for the new updates, and to NACCHO and CDC for providing the resources for these updates. Additionally, we are grateful to the designers and web developers who created a really beautiful new aesthetic for the guide, and a full acknowledgements again for these updates are included on the About page of the website. So where did all of this begin? Health Equity Guide was originally developed in 2017, and it was developed to answer a common question that we were hearing from local health departments in our work nationally, which was, what are some specific strategic steps that we can take to advance health equity in our organization and with our communities? And so the guide became a comprehensive resource, online resource for governmental public health to support building practice and power for health equity. So the original site included 15 strategic practices organized into 4 categories, 28 case studies from local health departments demonstrating how these strategic practices can be applied, and a comprehensive resource library. The framing of the original guide encouraged users to jump in anywhere. It didn't provide specific guidance or a sequencing to the strategic practices. So how is it going? Where are we now? Well, a lot has happened in the past 7 years. HIP's own theory of change and frameworks and practices have deepened and evolved. We've all experienced a global pandemic and the racial justice uprisings in the wake of George Floyd's murder in 2020. And there has been increasing backlash to equity and racial justice work in recent years. So last year, with funds from CDC, from NACCHO, we embarked on updating the Health Equity Guide to better reflect the current context and evolved thinking and practice of health equity across the field, as well as at HIP. So we convened an internal work group to advise on the updates and develop the new content, with a focus on updating the overall framing for the guide, as well as the strategic practices. So we now have a new Health Equity Guide that is organized along a cyclical framework to help guide health equity practice at health departments, and an updated set of 15 strategic practices. We also have a beautiful new design that elevates this new framework. And our new framework is rooted in story, and Victoria will share more about that.
Thanks, Rebekah. Now let's get into our specific updates. So our framework, rooted in the story of gardening and tilling the soil, was deeply influenced and inspired by the wisdom and practice of many people, including Indigenous communities and their practice of companion planting, Dr. Kamara Jones and her allegories, including the Gardener's Tale, GARE, and other organizational change frameworks that center equity, and the lineage of storytellers, as Rebekah mentioned. And now here is our story. A group of gardeners is looking to grow food for their community. They are mindful of the colonial history and current context of the land they occupy. The gardeners want to break the cycles of extraction and occupation by building a garden with and for the community that they will have long-term benefits for collective health, well-being, and autonomy. When the gardeners are ready to plant their seeds, they begin by cultivating the soil. They make sure the garden will have all the nutrients it needs to thrive, plenty of sun and water, nitrogen and oxygen, and other necessary vitamins and minerals. The gardeners also ensure the garden will be welcoming and supportive of pollinators, as the relationships are necessary for the plants to bear fruit. When the conditions are ready, the gardeners select and plant their seeds. The gardeners know that the healthiest gardens are ones that nurture a diversity of plants. So the gardeners select different varieties of seeds to grow together, those that are good companions for each other. The different characteristics of the different plants support a healthy and sustainable environment for the whole garden. The gardeners plant the seeds and begin the intensive work to care for them. The gardeners use their individual and collective strengths to care for the plants and mitigate threats to their growth. As the seeds grow, the gardeners continue to make sure they have the sun, water, and nutrients they need. They continue to weed and fertilize as needed to keep the garden healthy. The gardeners ensure the garden is open to and in relationship with diverse pollinators from across the surrounding environment to support the plants to fruit. Once the plants bear fruit, it is time for the gardeners to harvest and share the food with their community. Through this harvesting and sharing, the gardeners are able to see the impact of their garden in their community and how the fruits help to nourish and strengthen the people and environment around them. After the harvest, they gather seeds from the fruit to plant again and to share with others. The gardeners also prune and compost. Leftovers become nutrients for the garden and help prepare the garden for the new growing season. So we use this story as an allegory for how health equity practice grows and operates within and among organizations. Public health practitioners are the gardeners, supporting the health and well-being of their community. And to do that, they need to cultivate a flourishing garden of health equity strategies and practices that will support the just and equitable outcomes and impacts they want to see in their community. Just like the gardeners begin by cultivating their soil, our framework begins with strategies to cultivate the environment inside organizations for health equity practice to grow. Once the ground or internal conditions are ready, then it's time to plant the seeds or equity strategies. Like the gardeners, we encourage public health practitioners to select a diversity of strategies that are mutually beneficial, ones that will support and reinforce the development and effectiveness of others. As practitioners continue to care for their growing strategies, they will eventually bear fruit, resulting in change policies, practices, relationships, and outcomes. Harvest time includes celebrating wins, deepening your relationship with communities, and recommitting to growing more and different varieties of equity strategies in the future. The 15 strategic practices that we mentioned before are organized according to this framework. On the website that we'll show you a little bit later, you can navigate an intro page for each stage that describes the strategic practices, and then each strategic practice has its own page with more detail about what the practice entails, recommended action steps to implement that practice, and links to resources that support further learning.
Okay, thanks so much, Victoria. We're now going to take a closer look at each stage of the framework and the strategic practices at each of those stages. So this initial stage of development, as Victoria mentioned, is about cultivating your organizational environment for effective equities practice. This is the soil, the nutrients, those resources that you need to plant and grow equitable strategies and outcomes. So the first strategic practice here is build your container. A container for equity work is a set of practices, norms, and values that guide how you, your team, and your partners are together. It holds the process and relationships rooted in equity and belonging that make it easier for groups to do hard work together. This comes first because it holds everything else. The second strategic practice at this stage is build internal infrastructure and capacity. This practice speaks to building both the structures, the roles, the resources, the teams, as well as the capacity, the skills, the mindsets, the knowledge needed to develop and implement equity strategies. Effective health equity infrastructure needs dedicated roles and resources, strong leadership commitment, transparent communication, shared analysis, and accountability mechanisms. Defining this structure and beginning to align resources and capacity will set you up well for the next few practices. So the third practice here is develop a shared analysis. To effectively advance health equity, we need to have an understanding and an analysis of what creates and maintains inequities, what change is needed, and how to build towards that change. This analysis is part of building our capacity, which is part of the previous strategic practice, and will be an ongoing part of learning and practice for your equity work. This shared analysis is also foundational to the next strategic practice, which is articulate your vision and values. So a vision statement describes the future that a team is working to achieve. This is a big, bold statement that we need in order to do big, bold work. Values are the principles and beliefs that guide the team's work. So together, the vision and the values provide a compass that informs strategic planning, programming, and decision-making. And then to move on, to move and really implement these strategies and take action to advance this big, bold vision and commitment, we need to have shared leadership and innovation, which is our fifth strategic practice here at Cultivate. So to transform the systems, policies, and outcomes, we need leaderful movements and organizations, ones that share leadership, planning, and decision-making across roles and across expertise, and also ones that call on people with positional power to use their authority to set direction and set expectations and allocate resources to equity work. One thing to note here is that this is the only stage that is sequenced. We felt this was important because each practice here builds on the others. The earlier ones support the development and effectiveness of the later ones. However, while this stage is sequenced, it's not a checklist. It's more of a rolling process where one practice needs to be started and in development before beginning the next.
Now, before I take us into plant, I also just want to remind folks that if any questions have come up, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A feature, or any comments. We do have HIP staff kind of going through that, and we'll bring those to the Q&A section towards the end of this. So next we have plant. The second stage of development is all about planting your seeds and identifying and implementing your equity strategies. So starting with the first one here, building narrative power, we understand narratives are fundamental to the way we make sense of the world and imagine the future. This strategic practice emphasizes that public health's narrative power should be built in partnership with groups working to build community power and make structural changes. And this really requires an understanding of power, how to build and how to wield it. We also have mobilize data and research, and this practice is a reminder of the importance of data collection and research being centered in communities and their experiences. So to advance health equity and racial justice, public health needs an approach to data collection and analysis that is rooted in sharing and building power in partnership with communities most harmed by structural inequities and racism. The next one we have here is change internal policies and practices. And as Rebekah mentioned, you'll notice how strategic practices in different stages build on one another. And that becomes apparent as we're talking about changing internal policies and practices. The written policies and practices should be a reflection of your organization's values and cultures as discussed and hopefully developed in the cultivate stage. So in order to get to that point, internal policy and practice change requires things such as leaders with power to make an organizational commitment to upholding and sustaining equity and justice practices internally, just to name one part that is needed. Next, we have pursue policy change that transforms the root causes. And when we say root causes, we are talking about power imbalances and structural oppression. In order to effect transformative change and eliminate inequities, this strategic practice outlines the need for public health organizations to pursue policies that change the root causes and align with the priorities of communities most impacted by inequities and community power building organizations who are already doing the work. Next, we have build strategic partnerships. And as governmental agencies, public health departments are well positioned to hold strategic partnerships across both community and government. At the heart of these partnerships, when effective, are authentic relationships between people. So it's really important to remember that these relationships can take time to develop, especially in communities that are most harmed by injustice. So we always, always, always move at the speed of trust when we're working to build partnerships internally and externally. The last strategic practice in this section is support community power building. It's not the role of government agencies to directly build community power, but they are strategic allies to community power building organizations, CPBOs, also known as grassroots organizing groups, or social movement groups. This strategic practice discusses how public health departments have access to unique forms of governmental power that should be leveraged to support the campaigns and goals of CPBOs. And as I mentioned, these practices are complementary and grow out of and are nurtured by the cultivate stages. And you'll continue to see that throughout as we continue into harvest. And you may notice that, yes, cultivate was sequenced and plant does not have a sequence. And that's because during the plant stage, you can select and make choices about what to do, when to do, and which ones to pursue at the same time based on the priorities, context, and needs of your organization and community.
So the third stage, harvest, includes practices that support learning and sharing about your impacts, celebrating successes, and deepening your equity practice to align more with social movements, as well as shifting organizational culture to one of belonging and solidarity. So this stage has 4 strategic practices. The first is align with and support social justice movements. This practice deepens the work of building partnerships and pursuing policy change to align your organization's equity work with social justice movements. Our health equity work internally has to be connected to and supportive of the goals and work of broader social movements in order to be effective and to create the systemic changes and the power shifts necessary to achieve racial justice. Some of the action steps that we highlight in the strategic practice include learning about social movements, history, both locally, nationally, and globally, developing deep and meaningful relationships with local community organizers in your community, and prioritizing bringing resources to coalitions that are actively working to transform the material conditions in communities. Next, we have gather learnings and share insights. This practice is about conducting evaluations, gathering data, both qualitative and quantitative, gathering your lessons, your stories, and other insights about your health equity work and its impacts as part of your ongoing efforts to advance health equity. Understanding the challenges, the successes, and the impacts of your strategies will allow you to better adapt future work for greater impact. So this practice also lifts up the importance of celebration and joy, taking time to celebrate the wins, have joy in the work, no matter how big or small. The third practice at this stage is plan for sustainability. Health equity work, which requires us to address and transform the root causes of inequities, power imbalances, and systems of oppression, is long-term work that transcends political cycles. So we have to plan for sustainability and plan in ways that are flexible and adaptive to the changing political and other conditions in our environments. Aspects of sustainability that we need to attend to include resources and infrastructure, analysis and staff capacity, partnerships, and developing inside-outside strategies and relationships. And finally, we have shift organizational culture. So this practice speaks to the need to shift our organizational cultures to reflect and embody our core equity values and beliefs across all areas of the organization. This shift moves us from positioning ourselves and pursuing health equity while still part of dominant culture systems to having a transformed organization that supports and nourishes our health equity work. We want our organizations to embody and reflect equity culture, one that centers belonging and solidarity, mutuality and community, health and liberation for all. Now, you may notice that these practices at this stage connect to strategic practices at the other stages of the framework. And this is not by accident. This framework is intentionally cyclical because our work and our lives are cyclical and seasonal. So as we implement strategies and learn from those experiences, we have to return to cultivate and return to the strategies that we planted, but we return with a deeper, more nuanced, new perspective on the impacts and the work that we're doing so that we can continue to deepen our commitment and practices across all stages of the framework as we continue to move our work forward.
So now we get to the fun part for me, at least, and that is navigating the website and showing you all the new and improved health equity guide. So here, we can go back to the home page. Here it is. You'll notice there's a lot more components. We wanted to make this extra user-friendly and also bring some creativity and some fun to this new design. So as you enter the new website, you'll be welcomed. You'll see some introduction here at the beginning. You'll get a little glimpse of what the Health Equity Guide is, and then you'll see the entire framework here. Everything you see here from cultivate, plant, and harvest, you can click on, and that will take you to that specific stage where you will then find the strategic practices. But as you continue to scroll on our homepage, we'll give you more of a preview for each stage here, a nice little intro, which is also, you can click on this and be taken to a specific page as well. We have cultivate, plant, harvest, and then at the bottom of the screen, you'll get an overview of what's new and where you can find more about the allegory and the previous work done on the Health Equity Guide. So we're going to show you one of the stages. We'll go to cultivate here. So after clicking one page, then you are introduced to cultivate. And here it gives you backgrounds, it gives you an explanation, and dives deeper into what this stage entails and what the goals of this section is. As you continue to scroll, you'll then find the strategic practices organized. All of the ones Rebekah and I covered are organized into the 3 stages. And as Rebekah mentioned, this one is also sequenced. So you would have the step 1, step 2, step 3, and so on and so forth. And then once you click on one of these strategic practice pages, that's where you really get into the meat of that strategic practice. You get an overview of what we mean when we say things like build your container, a lot of information on that, It gives you an explanation on what a well curated and held container will look like, as well as links to resources from HIP or external partners, and then action steps that health departments or organizations can take to start to implement or start to work towards actualizing this stage. And then, of course, additional resources to help you, your team, in your learning. And then from there, you're also able to continue on to step 2, step 3, and onward. And the same is true for the plant and the harvest stages as well. So if we go to we'll see at the top that you can also navigate to each stage there, cultivate, plant, harvest. And then we also have this hamburger menu where you're also able to access other important things like our about page, which I think we dropped in the chat earlier. Well, you'll see things like our acknowledgement, our inspirations, how this came to be, all the beautiful and brilliant HIP staff that worked on this project. All of that can be found in our About page. You'll also see the companion planning allegory that I read earlier. It's here in its entirety, so you're able to review that yourself, go back and look at it, reference it, etc. And then we also have a glossary. The previous health equity guide had a glossary, but we went back and revamped these terms, added new ones that will show up on each page. So all of those you can still access there. And then last but not least, we still have case studies. If you're familiar with the original health equity guide, it included case studies. We have left those here in its own little library, and we really encourage folks to use the search function for case studies. And these have not been updated yet in this round of updates. And we hope that to update the case studies in the future, but these are the same ones from the original health equity guide. So you can search by state. There's other things in there to get to, if you recall using in the past, to find a case study there. I will also note that our website is printable. We've included a feature where you're able to print the content directly from the browser. So if you're using Safari, Internet Explorer, Chrome, if you go to File, Print, you will have a full page of content that then you can go print and take with you, highlight all the fun things. So that is the updated health equity guide. And I think now we will transition into our question and answer portion.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, y'all. Appreciate Rebekah and Victoria, all of this information that you've shared. Appreciate some questions that have come in. I think we want to start with how did you choose which strategies go into which categories?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jessi. Thanks for that. When we reflected on our experiences working with health departments across the country, we've learned a lot. And one of the things that we've learned is that there really is a logic or a relationship between practices, that some practices really are foundational to others being most impactful and effective. And so, for example, to effectively build partnerships with community power building organizations, health departments need to have a clear analysis of power, of root causes of inequities. They need to have shared leadership internally, willing to be innovative and develop creative and innovative partnerships with power building organizations. And there needs to be the infrastructure and resources to best support these partnerships. So there is a sort of a natural sequence that was emerging where creating the foundations and conditions internally really do need to come first, or at least be started first, so that there's a foundation there and there's conditions that will best support and nurture strategies that affect policy, communities, as well as the internal policies that you want to be changing. So we added, so we felt like there was a natural sequence to that, given our experience around what's foundational to create the conditions for effective strategies to transform organizations, institutions, and community relationships. And then we added practices. Most of the harvest practices are new to the updated guide, because we acknowledged that equity work really needs to be iterative. We need to have intentional space and time to learn, to identify and track our progress, to share stories, to hear from our communities and partners around their experiences, and to recommit for the long term to build sustainability for practices. So we felt like it was really important. We saw this progression and wanted to make it clearer through this guide that there is a sequence and relationship among the strategic practices.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rebekah. We have another question. Part of Cultivate is taking strategic risks to advance equity. Can you share some of the considerations that health departments should keep in mind when deciding when and how to take risks in their work?
Yes, thank you so much for that. I mean, there's lots of different considerations. And one of the things to keep in mind is that risk is contextual. And so we want to be mindful of positionality, of power dynamics and structures, of relationships, and the existing external conditions for the health department and the community partners when identifying and assessing risk. And it's really important for health departments to lean into and exercise the power and authority that they have to push bold, creative, innovative solutions. And so we really want to be considerate of both what are the conditions and the context around power, relationships, and both internally and externally, as well as thinking about what are the changes and how can we as a health department wield our power and authority in a way that supports the communities that we serve, that is in alignment with our health equity values, and that can help push the needle, kind of push us forward towards this big, bold vision of equity. And so those risks might be considering new ways of allocating resources. It might be thinking more creatively about who we engage as partners. So health departments that haven't yet built relationships with community organizing organizations and power building organizations may then build those relationships and those partnerships, which may initially feel like a risk as we're going outside of our traditional partners, but can really be fruitful for the transformative change that we're looking to achieve.
Thanks, Rebekah. Another really great question we got: can this guide's concepts be transferred to other organizations besides health departments? So, for example, could we share this guide with partners who are also trying to build institutional support for health equity work, such as health centers?
Yes, thank you for that question, Jessi, and whoever put that in the chat. Excuse me. So the original audience for the Health Equity Guide in its first iteration was health departments, and this time we did kind of pull in expertise from across HIP for folks who work with different parts of public health to kind of broaden that kind of reach. So yes, we do use language like health departments, but we also try to lean into public health organizations and do think these concepts that we outline in the strategic practices and throughout can be used to support health equity work in any kind of, institution, organization. And I think Rebekah mentioned earlier, being aware of the context needed to apply and think through those things.
Yay, thank you, Victoria. Another question: do you have suggestions for locating and/or seeking out community power building organizations to work together with our local health department?
Yes, HIP actually has resources specifically about building partnerships with community power building organizations. And so we can locate those and share those in the chat for folks that we have power analysis and building collaborations. And so we recommend that you all can take a look at those and really kind of doing the internal assessments that you need to do to identify and ensure that you're ready to engage in those relationships, as well as some of the tips and strategies and practices of initiating relationships, holding one-on-ones with potential partners. And we also have some of those resources linked on our strategic practice page on the Health Equity Guide, specific to building and sharing power, supporting community power building. So we can share that as well in the chat.
Great. Thank you, Rebekah. Unless a couple more questions come in, I think this might be our last one right now. One person said, I found that many folks enjoy talking about equity as a concept, but are almost unable or unwilling to translate that concept of equity into material conditions such as pay, or non-material elements such as control over our own labor and time. I suspect a piece of that is what you all talk about with respect to organizational culture.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. And there's a lot of things that are critical to attend to, both within organizational culture and within container building. And we see those two practices really connected, that the building of your container is really what Adrienne Marie Brown talks about, and we lean on her practices, her emergent strategy practices in our work as well, of really starting on the small that we can replicate to the large. And so what can we attend to at the small scale while we're building our containers, really making explicit the types of relationships, values, processes, and practices that we want to implement, and how can we model those and work strategically to expand those practices as a way to shift organizational culture. And so many of the institutions that we're a part of are really rooted in dominant culture characteristics. And so we are really working towards, both internally and in partnership with our communities, working on identifying and modeling the practices that can promote belonging, inclusion, mutuality, community, again, both internally to our organizations with staff and other teams, as well as with our community partners. So we need to be modeling both at the small scale what we want to see at the large, as well as internally what we want to see externally.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rebekah and Victoria. Appreciate all of the questions you were able to answer. Thank you, everyone, to the questions that you submitted, and to the engagement in the chat. Seeing a lot of clapping, I think, both for the question and for the answer, if I'm understanding correctly. So just so much love and appreciation to you both. Is there anything else that you want to share about the Health Equity Guide?
I'll share that we are also open to your feedback and suggestions as you engage with the updated Health Equity Guide. You can find our email also located on the website itself. And we really want to hear from you all. What is useful? What have you been able to implement? What stage you're working in? Where extra needed resources or support could be? Yeah, just adding that, like, as much as you love hearing from us, we love hearing from you and how it's working at your organization or institution.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Victoria. And I think one of the other things I would add is that many of you already have health equity work well underway and within your organizations. And so this guide is really a way to that, while maybe you already have a shared analysis, maybe you've already started to build infrastructure. And so you are really focused on strategies in the plant stage. That's great. We are not asking folks to kind of go to start from scratch again, but really think about, like, how can we better attend to the conditions, always returning to that cultivate, and really investing in making sure that our strategies are well nourished and have the resourcing and the support and the container that's needed for them to flourish. So the cyclical framework, again, is really intended to demonstrate and communicate how iterative the work of equity is, and that we're always returning to the foundational work to ensure that we have a strong base for our strategies and our relationships to have the greatest impact. And so this tool and this framework can really be applicable to wherever you are in your work, and hopefully will support you in also giving kind of new consideration and a different perspective, a deeper analysis for where you are, what the impacts you're having, and how to strengthen that work as you move your work forward.
Thank you both. And as you were chatting, just wanted to note that there's another question that came in through the chat. Step 3 of cultivate sounds simple, but could be really tough because agencies collect a lot of data. Do you have a recommendation for a starting point for shared analysis that has worked in the cases you studied?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, there's a lot for developing a shared analysis. This is both about collecting data and information, understanding the inequities that are present in your community and how those show up. It is also about learning about what are the root causes of inequities, what are power analyses. So a lot of this is about cultivating a space of learning and dialogue for your teams and for your staff. And so there's lots of different resources that can support learning and conversation, whether that's articles, videos, documentaries, podcasts. We really encourage organizations to create the container and space for ongoing practice. Communities of practice. We support organizations to facilitate and organize communities of practice. And we have resources on the Health Equity Guide about communities of practice. We really support folks in thinking about that the container building and how important that is to create space for dialogue and learning, that we can really build shared meaning through those conversations and through leaning on the wisdom of leaders, activists, organizers, thought leaders, authors who are already present in our communities and are the basis of the analysis that we use. So really leaning into those resources is going to be really useful as a place to start. And this is one of the key practices, the building your analysis, that will be very iterative and ongoing. There's always more for us to learn and unlearn and think about what our new practices are. So really kind of continuing to return to and deepen that analysis is part of the ongoing work of our equity practice.
Thanks, Rebekah. I also want to note a comment in the chat that is also getting some attention, and want to bring up too that they say, I've seen within a health department that the main focus is the garden and not the gardener, right? That the gardener is also tired and also needs care. And I wanted to note, I think that is a major part of your metaphor for a reason, right? That the gardener is an active part of this garden and ecosystem. Is there anything else to say on that?
I can, speak to that a little bit. And I think, it's really important to nourish along the way. And I think the part of bringing in, or our intention behind bringing in harvest and sustainability is to sustain the people, the gardeners doing the work. We like to highlight celebrating joy, wins, small or large, like everything, because that is part of, we do hard work and we do hard work together. The goal is to do that together. So it's really important to nurture and love and create a space of belonging for the staff and gardeners as they're doing work. And then that will be reflected in the outcomes of the garden.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Victoria. That's making me think about how expansive this allegory and story can become. And so we encourage you to also make it your own. What are the aspects that you would add to this story? What is true for how it's reflected for you? How can we create more space for the gardeners, a community of gardeners, to really support a community garden that's flourishing in your area? What are all of the, when we were creating this, we were talking about what are the weather patterns? How do we kind of reflect political cycles and the weather patterns that we also have to consider as gardeners? So there's a lot of ways that we really encourage you to make this story your own as well, and think about how can we what are the other elements of this work that we need to be attending to that are all part of this ecosystem of health equity that we are all actively engaged in.
Awesome. Thanks both. Another thing that just came in the chat, curious about your thoughts on adapting language for some audiences who might be resistant to some of the health equity terminology, but struggling with how their response to a given quote unquote problem isn't working. So such as using the criminal system to penalize versus public health to address addiction. And I am sort of trying to anticipate what your answer might be here, that it might still come back to building the container and building shared analysis, but I want to kick it over to you to answer.
You got it, Jessi. Those are the first things that come to mind for sure here. I think this is why it's so important to really focus on and attend to the internal conditions. Find and lean into the internal community of champions who have a shared deep analysis, who can share and speak the explicit language that you all need and that will support what you're doing, so that when you're talking to external partners or need to adapt your messaging to your audience, you know, and your kind of internal team that you're working with and your partners, your external partners who are close collaborators, all know where those messages are rooted. What are the values? What's the analysis? What are the intentions? Where the language and the messaging that you're choosing to use for an audience is still rooted in your vision and your values and the goals, the equity goals that you are trying to achieve. There's many paths to get to the goals that we want to see, and we need to be really rooted for ourselves in what that language is, be as explicit for ourselves and our close collaborators, so that when we have to adapt, we're still rooted and moving towards that shared vision, so that it doesn't dilute what we're trying to do, but it's really a strategic choice to make choices there. Victoria, is there anything you would add there too?
100%, Rebekah. My mind is going to shared language and how we never want to dilute or water down our message, but as long as it's rooted in our shared values, how that adaptation will still have the same or similar impact as what we intended. So, I think the thing we can send home is, creating that container to develop a shared language and rooting everything in our values and being sure not to water it down when we are adapting our messaging.
And because we're here to talk about the Health Equity Guide, I'll just give a plug for one of the strategic practices that could be really, in addition to analysis and container building for this question, is building narrative power. So thinking about the kind of core narrative, the transformative narrative, and then what are the messages that are rooted in that narrative. So that could also be another kind of key practice to be building in your organization.
Excellent. Thank you both. I think that we are ready to wrap.
Yes, thank you all so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We are so excited to have this resource out in the world, and we hope that you find it useful. As Victoria said, we are always open and encourage hearing from you all. We love to hear how this is living on and supporting your work, any questions and stories that you have. You'll see on the slide here that we have an email address. So if you want to learn more, if you want to connect with us at HIP to learn more about this resource, how it could be applied in your work, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're happy to engage with you on that. And I also just want to give a shout out and a big thank you to our HIP staff and colleagues who are here supporting the webinar, who really helped make this webinar happen and run so smoothly today. Thank you so much, Jamie, Clara, Jessi, Steph, others who have really supported us in getting this together. So thank you so much. And thanks, Victoria, for joining today.
Of course. Thank you all.